The screen fades into a breathtaking aerial view of a massive oceanfront mansion in the Hamptons. Laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the murmur of high society fill the air. The camera slowly pushes through the crowd of elegantly dressed guests until it stops at the center aisle, where everyone is whispering and gasping. "Why would Ethan Parker marry the maid?" a woman hisses to her friend, her diamond earrings catching the sunlight. The camera pans to Ethan, tall, impeccably dressed, yet visibly tense, standing at the altar. Beside him, Grace Miller, her hands slightly trembling, lifts her chin with quiet dignity. She isn't what these people expect to see in a Hamptons wedding. Not at all. The narrator's voice cuts in, calm but charged with suspense. What started as a cruel bet is about to become the most life-changing love story you've ever heard. And trust me, you won't believe what happens next. As the music swells, the screen briefly flashes images of what's to come. Shouting, tears, champagne glasses shattering, a kiss in the rain, a lonely walk down a dark street, before cutting back to the wedding, freezing just as Ethan takes a deep breath to say his vows. The Polo Bar in Manhattan glowed like a polished coin under golden lamps, all leather booths, framed horse portraits, and the murmuring swagger of money at rest. Ethan Parker swirled his bourbon in a heavy-cut glass, its amber rim catching the light like a dare. Across from him, Chad Reynolds grinned the way men grin when they think the night belongs to them, sleeves rolled, watch flashing, voice pitched to travel. 30 days, Chad said, letting the number hang above the table the way a chandelier threatens to drop. You marry her in 30 days and make her pass as one of us. Elegant dinners, flawless posture, media-ready smile. A Parker wife. Ethan's jaw tightened, then softened into the old smirk that had gotten him into and out of most fires. Name the stakes, he replied, eyes never leaving Chad's. Around them, cutlery chimed like tiny bells. A couple at the corner spoke in whispers. A waiter glided past with the hush of a secret. Chad tapped the table twice. Public bragging rights, and a 7-figure donation to the Parker Foundation. If you chicken out, you pay twice and admit it on page 6. The words landed with a soft thud. Ethan looked toward the bar mirror, where his reflection stood trapped between Chad's laughter and his own father's silhouette in his head. "Deal," he said, casual as a shrug that disguises a bruise. Grace Miller entered the scene the way dawn enters a tired town, quietly, doing the work no one else wants to wake for. She wore a simple uniform and carried a tray balanced like a promise. The scent of seared steak and her grandmother's cheap lavender lotion clung to her hands. Her eyes had the shore grey of someone who has known both wind and waiting. When she set a plate down, Chad's gaze flicked over her with the entitlement of a man who mistakes women for rooms to enter without knocking. "There she is," he murmured. Ethan didn't look at her at first. Pride makes men blind until it makes them reckless. When he finally did, it wasn't romance, he felt. It was a spark of defiance, the kind that turns embarrassment into gasoline. "Miss Grace, right?" he asked, reading the name tag too quickly. Her voice was steady, Midwest steady. "Yes, sir. Do you ever think about leaving all this?" The question surprised them both. Grace tilted her head, measuring his intent the way a careful cook measures salt. "Every day," she said, "but life doesn't always pay for the ticket." The tray felt heavier in her hands, the room suddenly thinner of air. The first conversation that mattered didn't happen in a restaurant. It happened on a bench near the staff entrance, where steam rose from street grates like the city's exhale, and the night smelled of pretzels, cabs, and almost December. Ethan found her there on his way out, a black car humming at the curb, driver waiting. "I can help," he said without a preface, the way men announce solutions before they've learned the shape of the problem. Grace's eyes narrowed. With what? Her phone had a cracked corner. Her coat had been mended at the sleeve. He told her about the foundation, about medical programs in Kansas City. He didn't say the word bet, not yet. If you needed support for your mother's treatment, he added, careful as someone placing a glass on the edge of a table. Grace, who had learned to distrust angels in expensive shoes, didn't smile. Nothing's free, she said. What's the price? Ethan hesitated, then went for the truth in increments. I need a favor, a public one. We get married, fast. You'll be safe, provided for. It's complicated, but you need a wife like you need a headline, she said dry. The siren of an ambulance cut through the block. Somewhere, a woman laughed too loudly. The driver checked his watch. What do I get? Ethan met her eyes, really met them. A signed agreement for full medical coverage for your mom. A way out, a way forward. Grace looked past him at the city's broken constellations. People like her don't get miracles. They get choices that taste like iron. I won't be mocked, she said. Not in my face. Ethan nodded, too quickly. You won't be. That was the first lie he intended to undo. They married under neon, the way some people confess under rain. Las Vegas, 2 days later, a chapel with a velvet aisle and a plastic bouquet, the air scented with hairspray and second chances. The officiant spoke like a man who made change for destiny on the hour. Do you, Ethan? I do, he said before the sentence ended, as if speed could save him from thinking. Grace's I do arrived like a careful bridge laid over a rushing river, each board placed with a measured hand. They left with rings that felt heavier than their gold, a certificate folded into a purse that didn't match her dress, and a motel room whose air conditioner rattled like a distant train. On the nightstand, Ethan placed the signed documents, treatment approvals, payment guarantees, a lifeline written in legalese. Grace traced the sharp edges of the papers, then folded her hands in her lap like prayer had returned to her by surprise. Thank you, she said, and it sounded like a yes to herself more than to him. News moves faster than vows. By the time the plane lifted off the runway, Page 6 had already married them twice, once in print and once in ridicule. Hotel heir weds maid in Vegas shock, the headline crowed, the photograph a slice of their faces at a bad angle. Ethan mid-blink, Grace mid-breath. Back in New York, the Parker household became a greenhouse for outrage. Richard Parker didn't yell. He curated his disapproval like art. You have taken our name, he said in a voice that could cut through oak, and tied it to a spectacle. Ethan stood in the office among maps of properties and photos of ribbon cuttings, feeling 12 again. It's my life, he said, and the words sounded hollow in a room built to echo wealth. Richard didn't look at Grace. He looked through the idea of her. And her, he asked. Is she your life too, or your latest project? The silence that followed was a verdict without a jury. In the foyer, house staff paused mid-step to listen. In the kitchen, Maria Lopez pressed 2 fingers to a silver cross and whispered a prayer for the new Mrs. Parker. Grace learned New York by the weight of its doors. Some opened for her now, elevators, private lobbies, a town car whose leather smelled like money's shadow. Others still resisted, tables that were fully booked, eyes that slid off her like rain from wax. A stylist arrived with swatches and opinions. A PR woman explained posture as if it were a new language. A dining coach corrected how she held a fork as though the future hinged on tines. Grace endured, absorbed, adapted, not out of shame, but out of a fierce, private loyalty to the woman in a Kansas City hospital bed who called every evening to ask about the weather and the wedding in the same breath. At night, in a guest room that looked borrowed from a magazine, she lay awake and listened to the apartment's expensive quiet. From the hallway came the faint echo of Ethan's footsteps and the click of a balcony door. Sometimes she almost liked him when he didn't know anyone was watching, his shoulders slumping, his hands raking through his hair, a man trying to unlearn something. The Hampton ceremony was not for love, it was for optics, and that's why it hurt. The lawn was a careful slice of paradise, the ocean performing its endless monologue just beyond the white chairs. Guests wore their judgments in tasteful fabrics. Photographers wore black like a uniform for vanishing. Ethan stood at the altar, the sun turning the rim of his cufflinks into small suns. Grace walked the aisle in a gown chosen by a committee, her bouquet perfumed with restraint. The vows had been rewritten by a brand consultant. The string quartet played a song that tested well with affluent demographics. And yet, when Grace reached Ethan, the wind picked up, and a strand of hair escaped and brushed her cheek like a soft refusal to be curated. She met Ethan's eyes, and for a flicker a different film unspooled. Two people on a bench near a staff door, a city breathing around them, a choice made at the edge of belief. "Ready?" Ethan whispered, a tremor tucked beneath the question. Grace's chin lifted. "Say what you mean," she whispered back. The officiant opened the leather folder. The crowd shifted like a living organism, and the ocean kept speaking in a language older than bets. Afterwards, when the toasts had been offered and the cameras had captured enough to feed a week of speculation, Chad found Ethan near the terrace, where the light broke over the water like glass. "You did it," Chad said, the grin a fraction too wide. 30 days on the dot. "Knew you had it in you." Grace stood a few steps away, pretending to study the coastline, her reflection faint in the window. Two Graces superimposed, the one she had been and the one they were trying to script. Ethan felt the old pride rise, then falter against something softer and more dangerous, the awareness that the wager had planted a seed he hadn't planned to water. He glanced at Grace and saw not a headline, not a project, but a person whose yes had cost her something irreplaceable. "Yeah," he said to Chad, voice neutral. "I did it." The words tasted like metal. Chad clapped his shoulder. "Next phase starts now. Let's make her presentable." Ethan's jaw worked. The ocean exhaled. Inside, someone laughed at a joke that wasn't funny. A gull cut a fast arc across the sky, as if drawing a line between what had been and what could be. And Ethan, he didn't know it yet, was about to cross it. The Tribeca penthouse wore its silence like a designer coat, soft to the touch, expensive to maintain, useless against real cold. Ethan let the door drift shut behind him and stood in the foyer, listening to the air conditioner hum and the faraway rasp of a siren sliding down West Street. Lights from neighboring lofts drifted across his floor, like restless fish. The glass walls turned the city into a living aquarium. He loosened his tie with fingers that wouldn't quite obey, then tossed it onto a marble console where it landed like a discarded verdict. On the coffee table, a copy of the Hamptons guest list lay open, annotated in his PR team's tidy handwriting. Who mattered, who pretended to, who had already called for a statement. He moved past it and set his phone face down, but the vibration crawled through the wood anyway. Texts from Chad with champagne emojis, a succinct "we need to talk" from his father, and a notification from a tabloid app that treated lives like weather. Ethan drew a breath that never reached the bottom of his lungs and told himself, the way he always had, that he was in control of the fire he'd set. He tried to work first. Men like Richard had trained him to believe that productivity was the antidote to regret. Laptop open, screen bright, spreadsheets in orderly columns, RevPAR, occupancy, pipeline, numbers that usually calmed him by obeying rules gravity could respect. But the cursor blinked like an accusation, and his reflection hovered faintly over the cells. A groom without sleep, a son without a map. He flipped the phone and scrolled. Chad. Tomorrow, 10 a.m., stylist, diction coach, posture boot camp, gonna mold her fast, brother. A second later, a photo arrived. The Vegas chapel's neon rendered as a meme, text slapped across it, from maid to maid. Ethan's jaw clenched. He typed and erased 3 times. Then Richard's message, "When you're ready to be a Parker, meet me at the office." No greeting, no sun, just a brand speaking to a franchise. He shut the laptop with a soft click and felt the room tilt, as if the building itself had inhaled and was waiting to see who exhaled first. The balcony door slid open with the hush of money well spent, and night air washed across his face, salted faintly by the river. Down below, headlights stitched bright threads along the highway. Somewhere, a motorcycle coughed, and someone shouted, and a dog barked at a deliveryman who did not slow down. Ethan gripped the railing and let memory do what it always did. Edit the past until it matched the story he could stand. Prep school in Connecticut. A field that smelled of cut grass and male certainty. A locker slammed. A nickname that stuck like burrs. He remembered fat fingers stealing his lunch, not because they were large, but because they were entitled. He remembered telling his father, and Richard's eyes hardening with a lesson instead of sympathy. They only bully what they can move. Become unmovable. Ethan had built a life of marble and elevators and calendar invites that never left room for being moved. But on a bench near a staff door, under the hiss of city steam, a woman had said, "I won't be mocked," and for a moment the boy inside him, soft, bruised, still looking for permission, had nodded in agreement. He found Grace in the kitchen, where expensive appliances pretended at warmth, and a single under-cabinet light turned stainless steel into a quiet moon. She stood barefoot on the cool tile, robe tied at the waist, infusing chamomile tea in a mug that read, "Property of nobody." The scent drifted, dried flowers, a little honey, the suggestion of rest. She glanced up, eyes steady in the kind of way that is not a performance. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, and her voice carried Kansas fields into a city that didn't know what to do with them. "Noise," he lied, then amended, "and noise that isn't noise." She smiled without humor. "New York's good at both." He meant to say something light, a line to establish distance, but what came out was, "Did the papers call you names?" Grace blew across the surface of her tea and watched the steam fracture. "They don't know my name," she said. "They know their idea of me." Ethan leaned against the island, noticing how his reflection in the black induction cooktop made him look like a ghost. "You shouldn't have to carry this." She lifted the mug. "You put it in my hands." He opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. I'll make it easier." Grace's laugh was soft, not unkind. "Make it honest," she said. "Easy comes later." Morning was a machine he stepped into and let run him. Trainer at 6, the penthouse gym all rubber and glass, river light turning dumbbells into docile meteors. He punished his body with clean repetitions, because pain that arrives on schedule feels like control. At 8, a call with the PR agency, voices smoothed by mastery, offering deliverables like anesthesia, key messaging, narrative pivot, a philanthropic initiative to season the feed. "We'll position Grace as a story of resilience," said the account lead, vowels polished, empathy calibrated. "We have a stylist, speech coach, media training, photo editorial in 2 weeks, soft lighting, natural fabrics, humble beginnings without the word humble." Ethan looked at his notes and saw not bullet points, but a blueprint for erasing someone. "She's a person," he said too sharply, and the line went delicate. "Of course," the lead replied. "Our job is to help audiences see that." The call ended with calendar links and a folder of mood boards that smelled like candles and obedience. He closed his eyes and saw Grace's hands, practical and careful, folding hospital forms the way some people fold napkins when they're anxious. At noon, he met Richard at the Midtown office, a cathedral of glass where employees lowered their voices as if devotion were mandatory. The elder Parker stood behind his desk like a judge who had agreed to hear an appeal he didn't expect to grant. "You've confused publicity with purpose," Richard said, gesturing Ethan into a chair that felt like a throne someone had forgotten to warm. "We don't make headlines, we weather them. He slid a folder across the desk, a revised prenup, a brand protection addendum, a calendar of appropriate appearances. "You will keep this clean," he said. "If you insist on this union, you will execute it with competence." Ethan stared at the paper and saw not clauses but cages. "She's not a liability," he said. Richard's eyebrow flicked like a metronome set to disappointment. "Everything is a liability until proven otherwise." The door opened. Maria Lopez entered with coffee, her presence a soft interruption that smelled of cinnamon and reassurance. She set the tray down and met Ethan's eyes for a heartbeat, something human passing like a note under a door. "Mr. Parker," she said to the father, and left the room with the quiet authority of someone who knows what actually holds houses together. Ethan signed nothing and left with the folder under his arm, a prop he had not agreed to use. Night brought Chad, because of course it did. Men like him arrive the way neon does, insisting they are necessary to the city's definition of itself. They met at a private bar in Soho, all brick and curated darkness, where waiters addressed Ethan by name and addressed Chad by volume. "Brother!" Chad boomed, clapping him on the back. Phase 2, polishing the sculpture. He slid a printed schedule across the low table, wardrobe fittings, a nutritionist known for turning actors into soldiers, a posture class during which women balanced books the way some balances require you to forget. "We'll iron the rough edges in no time," he said, miming an iron with his hand. Ethan pictured Grace's mug, property of nobody. "She's not a sculpture," he said. Chad grinned, uncowed. "Everything's a sculpture if the gallery's good." Ethan's patience frayed. "Call the donation in," he said, and the room went tight. "What?" Chad laughed. "We haven't even had the best part yet." Ethan stood, the leather couch whispering as it released him. "Donate, then get out of my marriage." He left his drink unfinished, and the city swallowed him, the night air chewing his anger into something he could breathe without choking. Back at the penthouse, he found Grace at the dining table, a lamp making a small pool of safe light in a sea of curated dimness. Papers lay in organized stacks, medical receipts, appointment schedules, a handwritten list of questions for a specialist in Kansas City. Her phone was on speaker, her mother's voice floated out, thin, brave, animated by the particular courage of women who discuss pain as if it were weather. "How was your day, honey?" her mother asked. Grace smiled toward the air, learning to use the right fork, she said, playful but not apologetic, learning to be looked at and not to stare back. Ethan stood in the doorway, a trespasser in his own house. Grace's eyes flicked up to him. She didn't startle. "I'll call you tomorrow, Mama," she said. "Sleep, okay?" She ended the call and began tucking papers into a folder whose edges had begun to fray. "I can hire someone to manage all of this," Ethan offered. Grace shook her head. "I know what questions to ask, and I know how to hear the answers." He hesitated. "Chad sent a schedule," he said. "I told him to donate and disappear." Grace's hands stilled, then resumed. "That won't make the cameras forget," she said, gentle as a warning. "But it might help you remember." He didn't sleep. He walked the apartment until the floor read his steps like a confession, then stood outside the guest room where Grace slept and watched the strip of light under the door thin and thicken as traffic passed, like the room itself was breathing. He raised a hand and did not knock. On his phone, a drafted message to Chad waited, short, final, the linguistic equivalent of closing a gate. He deleted the draft and wrote a longer note instead. "Donation confirmed. No more appearances, no more training. If you contact her, we're done." He hovered over send and then pressed it, feeling something small and stubborn inside him uncoil. In the living room, the skyline kept its counsel. The river drew a slow line that only the patient could see. Ethan pictured the boy on the prep school field and understood for the first time that invulnerability was just loneliness wearing armor. He turned toward the kitchen, made 2 mugs of tea he didn't know how to make right, and set one at Grace's door like a peace offering without expectation. Somewhere between the kettle's click and the quiet, a decision landed with the certainty of gravity. If this marriage had started as a performance, it would continue as practice, imperfect, daily, and for once, honest. Grace found the note at dawn, tucked beside a lukewarm cup of tea like a small, stubborn promise. No more lessons that make you smaller. Only the ones you choose. She read it twice, then pressed it flat under her palm the way you do when you're not sure if something is real or merely polite. Outside, Tribeca was still rubbing its eyes. A delivery truck sighed at the curb. The river wore a quiet blue that felt almost forgiving. She laced up a pair of sneakers bought on impulse the night before, the soles still too white, the tongues unfamiliar against her ankles. In the hallway mirror, she didn't try to look thinner or richer or anyone else's version of improved. She checked for alignment, chin level, shoulders loose, breath steady. Central Park was a cab ride and a mental permission away, so she granted herself both, surprising even herself with the swiftness of the decision. The taxi smelled like pine air freshener and last night's conversation, but the city outside the window played a softer reel than usual. By the time she hit the gravel path around the reservoir, the air tasted like cold pennies and new beginnings, and the soundtrack was the scuff of her shoes, her breath galloping, and 1,000 strangers training for their private wars. She didn't run so much as negotiate with motion, making deals with the wind and the ache under her ribs. To the next lamppost, she bargained. And when she made it, she granted herself another lamppost and the right to slow without shame. A woman in a neon jacket passed her and lifted a thumb in silent solidarity. A man in grey matched her pace for 20 steps and then vanished into a faster version of the same path. Grace noticed the smell of damp earth, the hush of leaves rehearsing their fall, and the sound of the city insisting on itself even in a place designed to pretend the city isn't there. She thought of the mug on her kitchen counter, property of nobody, and tried the sentence out on her lungs as if breath could claim it as truth. When a stitch stabbed her side, she stopped, pressed a hand to the pain, and laughed at the audacity of thinking change would arrive without sending a bill. "Okay," she told the air. "I hear you." A nearby bench received her like an old friend, and for a stretch of minutes she was simply a person catching her breath where so many had caught theirs before. Somewhere, a dog shook water from its coat and baptized the morning with tiny suns. Back at the penthouse, Maria Lopez had the kitchen awake. Coffee blooming in the French press, skillet warming, radio whispering a Spanish ballad about a heart that refuses to be evicted. "You went running," Maria said, eyes flicking to the shoes that now wore proof. "I went moving," Grace replied, letting the word hold more than exercise. Maria plated eggs with a pinch of smoked paprika and slid a bowl of berries across the island, then leaned her elbows on the counter in a posture that said, "I am listening without theater." "They will try to make your transformation a spectacle," Maria said, voice steady as a metronome, "so do not give them a show. Make it an education." Grace smiled at the clarity, at the way wisdom sometimes arrives disguised as housekeeping. "I want to learn," she said. "But not to be less me." Maria nodded, approving of both the ambition and the grammar of it. "Then choose your teachers," she said, and it sounded like both permission and instruction. In the corner, the city tried to break in through the window and failed. She built a syllabus the way a cook builds a stew. What she had, what she needed, what would take time to make sense. The public library branch on Murray Street gave her a library card that felt like a passport. The librarian, with the soft wrists and fierce glasses, recommended audiobooks on rhetoric, a series on American art, and a podcast in which two scholars debated etiquette without snobbery. At home, Grace played recordings on her phone and repeated phrases until her mouth understood them. Not to erase Kansas, but to braid it with Manhattan. She propped elements of style beside a thrifted anthology of speeches and laughed out loud when a sentence scolded her for loving adverbs like they were stray kittens. In the mirror, she practiced posture that felt like presence rather than punishment, stacking her bones as if rebuilding a house from the foundation up. When she mispronounced metropolitan for the third time in a row, Maria made her clap syllables like a first grader, and they both dissolved into laughter that vacuumed regret out of the room. Grace recorded voice memos and listened back, not to hate the sound, but to meet it with curiosity, the way you meet a neighbor you've only waved to from across the hall. Every night, she made a list of what she learned and what still felt like a locked door. Bodywork was its own curriculum, deeply inconvenient and not for spectators. A nutritionist at a clinic in the village asked questions that felt like respect, about sleep, stress, budget, culture, flavors that felt like home. "No punishments," the woman said, tapping her pen like a gavel. "We add before we subtract. We stabilize before we sculpt." Grace bought groceries that didn't try to impersonate virtue: salmon, brown rice, a pompous head of kale that submitted under garlic and olive oil, a basket of apples that smelled like crisp decisions. She learned that taking the stairs could be a daily referendum she could win without applause. She learned that water tastes different when you drink it like a promise. She learned that a walk after dinner turns a day from heavy to handled. When she binged fear instead of food on a particularly loud afternoon, she texted the nutritionist and received a voice note that sounded like a warm hand on a cooler forehead. One loud hour doesn't cancel a quiet week. Grace saved it and played it again when the headlines tried to pry her open. Ethan kept a respectful orbit, visible enough to be counted, distant enough to avoid colonizing the space she was claiming. He left the note and then left the room, but small proofs of his decision to be different accumulated like coins in a jar. You don't think matters until it does. He cancelled a slate of appointments with coaches who said transformation like a threat, forwarded her a contact for a community college public speaking workshop, and then did nothing when she did not reply for 3 days. One evening, she found him on the balcony, jacket off, tie coiled beside a glass of water, as if the evening had undressed for bed but stayed up to talk. "I dropped the posture boot camp," he said, the words landing without fanfare. "And the diction coach, who said Midwest like a diagnosis." Grace folded her arms against the railing and watched the river pretend it wasn't a mirror. "Thank you," she said, "because there are kindnesses you name instead of testing." After a beat, she added, "I'm okay learning, just not being remade." Ethan nodded, a student grateful for a thesis. "I'm learning too," he said, and for once it did not sound like a line designed to earn credit. The first public test arrived disguised as a kindness. A small luncheon at a gallery in Chelsea, raising funds for a literacy program. The invitation had come through the foundation, and the RSVP deadline glared like a lit match. "Low stakes," the PR lead said on the phone, voice paved smooth. "Friendly audience, photographers will be minimal." Minimal turned out to mean 3, which is exactly enough eyes to encourage a stumble. Grace wore a navy dress Maria had insisted was serious but not funereal, hair pulled back in a way her scalp tolerated. The gallery smelled like varnish, linen, and the delicate aggression of good perfume. A woman with eyebrows engineered for precision approached, lips bright, smile practiced. "You must be Grace," she said, extending a hand that contained the expectation of gratitude. "Welcome to the world of letters." Grace took the hand and didn't apologize for the calluses. "Thank you for having me," she replied, voice landing where she intended it. "Books made me feel rich long before anyone looked at my ring." The woman's eyebrows recalibrated by a millimeter, and someone standing nearby made a small sound that might have been the cough of surprise learning to be respect. When a photographer lifted his camera, Grace lifted her chin, not defiant, not submissive, simply present, and the lens stayed a lens instead of a verdict. After the luncheon, Ethan suggested lunch somewhere quiet, and they ended up in a corner booth at a bistro that actual New Yorkers like because it doesn't perform its importance. The table wobbled the way all tables wobble, and the waitress called them hon, without knowing she had just gifted Grace a piece of a language. She spoke well. They ordered roast chicken and a salad that did not apologize for the cheese it wore. "My dad thinks everything is a liability until proven otherwise," Ethan said, tracing the condensation on his water glass. "I've spent my whole life proving otherwise." Grace listened with her whole face, a habit that made people feel less alone without making them the center of the universe. "What did you want to be," she asked, "before you were an heir?" Ethan smiled, startled, as if someone had asked what he wanted for lunch on Mars. "A teacher," he said, then laughed at the absurdity and winced because it wasn't absurd at all. "I liked the idea of explaining things until they made sense." Grace cut into her chicken and nodded like a verdict had been reached in a gentle court. "Maybe start with yourself," she said, then softened it with a grin that let him have his dignity. The table wobbled again, and together they folded a napkin under a leg, small teamwork, pretending to be nothing more. Home looked less like a museum and more like a workshop once she allowed it. She colonized a corner of the study with index cards and highlighters, pinned quotes above the desk that felt like sturdy planks, and bought a used keyboard that made exactly the kind of wrong sounds a beginner needs to hear. At night, she practiced reading aloud to nobody, letting punctuation be a traffic signal instead of a leash. Maria listened sometimes from the doorway and clapped like a music teacher grading on courage. "Again," Maria would say, when a sentence tripped, and perfect when it didn't, and perfect enough when it needed to end. On Thursdays, Grace took the elevator to the lobby and forced herself to chat with Carl the doorman about baseball standings she didn't understand, and she watched his face soften at the effort rather than the content. "You're getting good at being seen," he said one afternoon, and she realized visibility didn't have to be a cage. Sometimes it was a porch light. When the headlines tried a new angle, she didn't read them. She read 3 pages of Baldwin and drank water, and sent her mother a photo of the sunset over the Hudson, which had the decency to be beautiful without asking for her opinion. The body, meanwhile, kept reporting progress in a language only patience can translate. The morning run extended from 2 lampposts to 4 to the reservoir's first curve, and she celebrated by buying socks that didn't hurt her feelings. The scale moved in whispers, but the mirror returned new data. Less flinch, more reach, steadier breath, a neck released from a century of bracing. She stopped bargaining with food and started bargaining with time. 10 minutes of movement traded for 10 minutes of forgiveness, 5 minutes of stretching invested for 5 fewer minutes of regret. On a wet Tuesday, she ran in a soft rain that turned the path into a polite rumor and came home soaked, hair pasted to her head, grin unedited. Ethan met her in the foyer with a towel and an eyebrow. "You look like a champion," he said, and she rolled her eyes because that word belonged to other bodies in other rooms. And then she decided maybe it could belong to hers in this one. They made omelets badly and ate them anyway, laughing when the folds split and the cheese escaped like a happy accusation. The apartment smelled like eggs and rain and a kind of safety that doesn't photograph well, which is the only kind that lasts. One night, Grace laid out 2 options on the dining table as if prepping for a debate with herself, a silver dress for an upcoming gala and a stack of pamphlets from a community college offering evening courses in public speaking and American art history. "Both are costumes," she said to the empty room, then corrected herself. "Both are tools." Ethan walked in and stopped, taking in the tableau without assuming it was his to solve. "The Met Gala," he said, nodding at the dress, "will be loud and sharp and full of people who mistake volume for value." He tapped the pamphlets lightly. "These will be quiet and sharp and full of people who know what they don't know yet." Grace weighed the fabric in her hands and felt the weight of her future redistribute. "I'll do both," she decided, surprising herself with the generosity of "But the dress is for a night, and this is for a life." Ethan saluted the decision like a flag had been raised in the right direction. "I'll be in your corner," he said, and she believed him not because he declared it, but because he had begun to practice it in small, unadvertised ways. The steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art gleamed like a stage, polished by a century of entrances, the sky above sharpening to a blade of dramatic grey that promised weather and attention in equal measure. Grace paused at the curb as the town car door opened, the city's breath hot with camera flash and clipped instructions, and the silver dress she had chosen without surrender caught the light as if it were speaking its own language. She felt the hem whisper against her calves, the cool metal of her bracelet steady against her pulse, the faint anchor of Maria's perfume on the shawl like a quiet benediction she carried. "One step at a time," she told herself, and the first step answered with marble's ancient patience, and the second with 100 whispers she could not control but would not swallow. Photographers chorused her name as if they had always known it. One shouted, "Turn, Mrs. Parker, chin up," and she turned, not like a prop, but like a person choosing to be seen. Beside her, Ethan adjusted his cufflinks, the small suns at his wrists, then offered his arm without telling her what to do with it, and she took it the way a rope is taken on a climb you decide to survive. Inside, the great hall inhaled them with its stone confidence, the banners for the Costume Institute floating like captured weather, the air perfumed by peonies, and the conviction of donors rehearsing their delight. Grace catalogued the sounds. A violin warming up beneath the gossip, a shoe catching the edge of a carpet and recovering, ice clinking in glasses that pretended to be casual, as a way of not being erased by any one of them. A woman with a satellite of diamonds around her throat sidled close, smile sharpened to a compliment that came preloaded with condescension. "Mrs. Parker, what a brave choice! Silver can be so unforgiving," she murmured, and a friend leaned in to watch the experiment. Grace let the words hover, then smiled with the warmth she keeps for children and ghosts. "I've found forgiveness is more about the person than the fabric," she replied, and the woman's eyebrows registered the unexpected, and then, just barely, respect. A reporter materialized with a microphone like a fishing pole. "Grace, what does tonight mean to you?" Grace felt the camera lens try to climb into her mouth and claim residence. "Books gave me rooms before I had keys," she said, measured, present, unpunctured. "So a night that funds literacy means other people won't have to learn to disappear to survive." Pens paused, cameras steadied, and somewhere a PR executive exhaled into a napkin. Chad Reynolds entered the Temple of Dendur like a rumor that believed itself a fact, tuxedo tailored to arrogance, smile calibrated to sell trouble as entertainment. The pool's black glass mirrored his approach in duplicate, doubling the hazard. The sandstone temple behind him held its ancient breath like a judge unimpressed with modern crimes. "Ethan!" he boomed, slicing through a cluster of patrons who flinched and then pretended not to. "There you are. Brought the star of the season." He dipped his chin at Grace in a gesture that might have been a bow if contempt hadn't snapped it in half. "We've arranged a little moment for you on stage," he said, tapping a folded card against his palm as if the paper itself had committed to the bit. A few lines, adorable stuff about coming from nothing and finding love in unexpected places. It'll photograph beautifully. Grace regarded the card as one regards a door you decline to use. noticing the smudge of ink at the corner, the thumbprint like a signature of laziness. "I don't read other people's stories on command," she said, and her voice did not reach for volume because it did not need to. Chad's grin tightened. He flicked his gaze to Ethan. "Remind your wife how nights like this work." Ethan's jaw worked once, twice, the muscle in his cheek a small storm contained. The MC took the stage in the Sackler wing with a smile that knew the choreography of generosity, and the room pivoted to applause the way schools of fish pivot to light. "We're thrilled to welcome the Parker Foundation," she sang, "and a very special guest, Mrs. Grace Parker, whose journey reminds us why literacy matters." Heads turned, cameras lifted, and for a beat that stretched, Grace felt her ribs count themselves like a choir deciding on a note. Ethan leaned in, a murmur woven for no one else. "Only if you want to," he said, and something in his tone had finally learned the difference between offering and ordering. Grace stepped forward, 3 steps, the dress adjusting without complaint, and climbed the 2 stairs that felt like 50. The microphone waited, a dark flower without smell. The temple watched, indifferent to modern applause. "Good evening," Grace said, and the first word steadied the second, and the second invited the third. "When I was little, my mother taught me to sound out words on soup cans and bus schedules and overdue notices, because reading was how we reminded the world we existed. A rustle, then stillness. If you left the right book in the right place, we could borrow an hour where no one judged our clothes or our bodies or our bank accounts." She glanced at the pool, where reflected light shivered. "Tonight we're paying for hours like that. For strangers we'll never meet, but will be better for having met a story." The applause was not loud. It was sincere in a room that usually prefers volume, and it rolled toward her like a warmer weather pattern she hadn't been told to expect. When she stepped down, Chad blocked her path with the choreography of men who treat public spaces like private theaters. "Sweet speech," he said, angling his shoulders so a roving camera could catch the tableau of magnanimity he was arranging. "Let's add a flourish. Tell them how Ethan rescued you from the staff entrance to the spotlight." Grace watched his face the way a pilot watches weather radar. She could see the storm he wanted just beyond the blue. "I wasn't drowning," she said. "I was working." Chad leaned in, breath spiced with expensive bourbon and impatience. "People don't come here for work stories. They come for fairy tales they can deduct." He flicked the folded card open, revealing words that tried to choreograph humiliation with adjectives. "Read it, or I start telling it my way." The temple seemed to lean forward. The pool waited for a splash that would never come. Grace tilted her head, listened to the centuries humming in the stone, and then smiled like the punchline had arrived early for once. "You're right," she said. "They came for a story." And then she turned slightly so the camera caught her full face. "Here's mine. I married a man because I thought a contract could save a life. Turns out the contract might be teaching another life how to be a man." A collective intake. Chad's grin misfired, and somewhere a journalist decided not to blink. Ethan arrived without haste, which is how you arrive when you mean to change the temperature of a room instead of its furniture. "Chad," he said, tone flat as a closed door that will not be opened by knocking, "you're in the way." Chad tried a laugh that used to work. "Relax, brother. We're giving them content." Ethan's gaze didn't budge. "Donate, then disappear." He lifted a hand, not to strike, not to plead, but to signal to the event coordinator standing 10 feet away that the evening would resume its dignity now. "The Parker Foundation is pledging $5 million to the literacy program," he said, louder, letting the announcement land where Chad had hoped a spectacle would, "in Grace Parker's name." A murmur rolled the length of the wing, surprise galloping ahead of admiration, and a board member who had been deciding whether to be friendly decided. Chad's voice dropped to the register of threats that fail the moment they're spoken aloud. You playing house with the help doesn't make you a hero, he hissed. Ethan's mouth moved into something that wasn't a smile. Treat my wife like a person, he said, each word placed on its own square of marble, or leave the building. Security didn't need a scene. They needed a decision, and Chad gave them one. Hands raised, grin stapled back into place, retreat framed as magnanimity for the cameras that kept receipts. The evening reknit itself, as evenings do when the crack is mended with public grace and private resolve. Donors approached Grace with questions that were not tests. A curator pointed out a detail in the temple frieze that tourists rarely notice, and a young volunteer with bitten nails told her in a rush how her own mother had taught her to read using supermarket circulars. Grace thanked each of them with the steady attention of someone who understands that listening is a currency that does not inflate with use. A journalist from a serious paper, not a tabloid dressed in seriousness, asked for a comment. Recorder already out. What do you want people to remember about tonight? He asked. Grace considered the question as if it were a door she might leave ajar. That dignity isn't something you inherit or buy, she said. It's something you practice on good days and bad ones until it fits. The quote went into a notebook that would become pixels and then, unexpectedly, a new premise about her that could be lived with. Across the pool, Ethan spoke with the MC, cheeks flushed not with embarrassment, but with the effort of choosing better in public. And when his eyes found Grace's, the glance didn't ask for rescue and didn't offer one. It acknowledged partnership in a language not yet fluent, but perfectly intelligible. Rain finally kept the sky's promise as they stepped out. The first drops fat enough to make even marble blink. The press line had thinned to the stubborn and the night shift, and the city's taxis threw yellow signatures across wet pavement like apologies for earlier impatience. The town car arrived with the quiet of a plan that does not need to declare itself. And inside, the leather smelled of good intentions that might survive the ride home. For a minute, neither of them spoke. The windshield wore 1,000 temporary rivers. The driver adjusted the wipers with a philosopher's economy. You didn't have to take the microphone, Ethan said, fingers worrying the seam of his glove before he remembered he wasn't wearing any. Grace shrugged a shoulder, small enough to fit inside the dress and big enough to tug at the evening. I didn't, she said, but I've been quiet in rooms like that for longer than feels healthy. He nodded like a student who recognizes the principle only after failing the first assignment. What do you want next? He asked. And for once the question wasn't a trap disguised as an invitation. She watched a couple dash under a single umbrella and laughed softly at the math. Sky, she said. Open sky and no cameras for a while. Somewhere I can hear myself choose. Ethan looked out at the rain, pretending to be applause. Napa, he said finally. This weekend. No events. Just vineyards, long roads, rooms with windows that open. Grace turned to him, measuring a promise she was no longer obligated to believe. Rooms with windows that open, she repeated, and the phrase tasted like a future she might sign for herself. The flight west felt like someone had opened a window in his chest and told the air it could stay. Napa greeted them with a light that didn't glare so much as forgive, gold-dusting rows of vines that ran like green cursive toward gentle hills, eucalyptus and dust sweetening the roads, the Pacific sending a cool hand inland at dusk. Their cottage sat off the Silverado Trail, a white clapboard tucked behind an old fig tree, windows that actually opened, curtains that moved like ideas. This is what I meant, Grace said at the threshold, fingers resting on the latch, as if asking permission from the house. Ethan set their small bags down and, without fanfare, put both phones in a wooden bowl by the door as if they were coins paying for silence. Analog weekend, he said. No schedules. He meant it. Yet there was a flash of worry on his face, the reflex of a man who has always believed being unreachable is a mistake you're billed for later. The innkeeper, a woman with sun-lined cheeks and a vineyard dog named Merlot, gave them a map dotted with arrows. "Walk everywhere you can," she advised. "This valley answers slower questions." They began with slowness, as if slowness were a language they were learning together. At a family winery near Yuntville, a vintner named Eleanor led them between barrels, the room cool and damp, yeast and oak performing an old ritual without applause. "Wine is patient fruit," Eleanor said, tapping a stave with her knuckles. "It becomes what you teach it to wait for." Grace inhaled, plum cedar, something like pencil shavings, and laughed at her own attempt. "Smells like a library at harvest time," she tried. Elena's smile widened. "Exactly." Ethan rolled the glass, listening with unusual attention, the way you listen when you've been accused of not listening and want to practice your defense in advance. "So you don't rush the pour?" he asked. "You don't rush the pour," Elena confirmed. They tasted at a long table that had hosted other truths before theirs, slicing a baguette so the crust crackled, olives shimmering in a small blue bowl, a wedge of cheese collapsing under the knife just enough to be interesting. Their shoulders touched when they reached for the same bite and both withdrew. There was a small comedy in the choreography of it, a shared grin that let the moment be lightly human rather than scripted. That afternoon, they picnicked on a rise where the valley widened, everything spread like a confession that had learned to be generous. Ethan unfolded a blanket badly. Grace rescued it with the competence of someone who has always made comfort out of not much. "Tell me something true you've never said into a microphone," she said, peeling an orange, releasing a bright spray that perfumed the air with childhood. He considered, then surrendered. "I wanted to teach," he admitted, resting on an elbow, a boy's posture repeating itself in a man. "History, not the dates, the cause and effect. The part where choices make more choices possible." Grace handed him a slice of orange like an award. "You'd be good at showing people where the hinge is," she said. She told him about Kansas summers, riding a bike on roads so flat the horizon felt like a dare, learning to fix a sink from a neighbor named Joe, the way the air smelled before storms. "My mother's hands always knew what to do," she said. "Mine learned late." When he reached for her hand in reflex, she didn't pull away. She turned it, palm up, and traced the faint line where work had left its first scar. "Proof of admission," he said softly. "To what?" she asked. "To a life no one gave you." They cooked that night in the little kitchen where the knives were sharp and the recipes handwritten. Maria FaceTimed in from New York to coach the risotto, her voice like cinnamon warming the pan. "Stir like you mean it," Maria commanded, and Grace stirred, laughing when Ethan tried to mansplain starch and then admitted he was wrong. Steam fogged the window, and outside the vineyard lights winked like polite neighbors. They ate at the narrow table with two chairs that insisted on closeness. "This is terrible," Ethan joked of his first bite, mouth already reaching for a second. "Make me suffer." Grace rolled her eyes. "Suffer quietly," she said, and he did, but not enough to miss the way she raised her glass to nobody and said, "To women who figure things out." He added, "To men who try not to be in the way." And they clinked and drank and let the silence afterward mean agreement rather than lack. The porch found them later, the boards worn smooth by other feet, the sky busy with stars that cities keep in storage. A radio inside the cottage leaked a slow song, strings and breath, something from the 70s that had practiced being tender until it could do so without embarrassment. Ethan spoke first, a risk he was trying to practice. "There's a part of me that still thinks this is a game I'm winning," he confessed, voice low. "Not the marriage, the optics. Like every decent thing I do is just strategy." Grace watched the sky for a beat and let the crickets answer part of it. "Maybe strategy is just training wheels," she said, finally turning to him. "It gets you moving in roughly the right direction until you can trust your balance." He exhaled, a laugh cut with relief. "What if I never trust it?" She said, "Then you keep riding, wobbly and stubborn, until one day you realize you've been balanced for a while." His phone vibrated somewhere inside the cottage. A small, insistent mechanical heartbeat. He didn't move. "Let it ring," she said without looking away from the constellations. Morning miles on borrowed bikes stitched the valley into a map their bodies could keep, past a tiny chapel with white paint peeling in honest curls, a farm stand stacked with peaches that perfumed the air with a promise, a lane where the eucalyptus brushed shoulders with the car like a blessing. They stopped at a tasting room with no PR strategy, only a chalkboard and a woman reading a paperback at the bar. It should have been invisible to cameras, which is why a camera was there, an influencer couple, curating rustic authenticity, drone buzzing like a persistent comment. One of them recognized Ethan with the efficient shock of people who train for it. "Oh my God, it's them," the woman whispered. "Too loud, can we, get a toast for the vlog?" Grace's smile held, but the skin at her throat tightened. A small semaphore, only people who live in their bodies notice. Ethan stepped in, gentle but clear. "Not today," he said. "We're terrible on camera before noon." The couple sulked, then pivoted their disappointment into content, as is the way. Outside, Grace breathed like she'd been held underwater and let go. "You can't stop all of it," she said. "No," he agreed, "but we can stop some of it. And we can be the ones who decide." Narrator, mid-story CTA, belonging trigger. "If stories like this move you, and you want to be here for the next turns, the quiet victories, the hard lessons, join us now so you don't miss a chapter. We share a new story every single day, and this community is built for people who feel every scene." That evening found them in the living room with a thrift store record spinning and a lamp making a warm puddle of light. Grace read aloud from a dog-eared Joan Didion essay she'd found on the cottage shelf, her voice testing cadences as if trying on coats. "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." Ethan listened the way men listen when they are, at last, willing to learn a language they were not given. "Read that again," he said, and she did, slower, and the words fitted the room. The song changed. He held out a hand without theatrics. "May I?" She laughed at how old-fashioned it sounded, and then stood anyway. They danced badly, then better, then in a way that made the room feel like a yes. When he kissed her, it wasn't a trophy kiss. It was the lean-in of a man who had finally stopped negotiating with his fear. She kissed him back with a caution that did not cancel feeling, and he accepted the terms without complaint. Somewhere in that quiet, an iPad on the side table blinked to life, CloudSync doing what CloudSync does. A preview banner sliding across the screen from a thread he hadn't opened in days. "Chad, you owe me a..." The notification folded itself away before either of them saw the rest. The room kept its yes, but a small hairline crack had introduced itself to the glass. On their last morning, fog draped the vines like an old sweater, and the valley asked them to whisper. Grace's phone, retrieved only to check in with the hospital, brought a voicemail from Kansas City. The specialist had an opening, a sooner-than-expected slot, an alignment of calendars that felt like choreography from a kinder bureaucracy. She pressed the message to her ear twice, then 3 times, as if replay could make the good news sturdier. "We can do it," Ethan said, already scanning flights, fingers ready to convert hope into logistics. She held his wrist, stopping the reflex. "We will," she said, "but let me have this minute." They stood in the doorway, both of them barefoot, both of them less afraid of what windows do. "When we go back," he said, "I'll talk to my father differently." She nodded. "And I'll talk to myself differently." The dog Merlot thumped his tail against the porch as if agreeing to terms. They packed slowly, folding the weekend into zippers and pockets, neither of them quite ready to move the bowl of phones. Morning in Tribeca arrived in grayscale, the sky the color of a secret not yet confessed. The penthouse was still and obedient, coffee ready on a timer, blinds half opened like careful eyelids, when the iPad on the side table sighed awake. A push notification bloomed across the glass, not loud but insistent. Another followed, and another, until the device pulsed like a heartbeat that didn't belong to anyone in the room. Grace, up early to call the Kansas City hospital, reached for the tablet and froze at the subject line. Receipts, the bet that made a bride. The post came from an account that dressed itself in journalism, clean fonts, muted palette, a handle that sounded like due diligence. Inside, screenshots, dates, times, text bubbles, Chad's giddy boasts, Ethan's clipped replies from that first week. 30 days, one message read. Marry her, fix her image, page 6 will choke. Another, from maid to maid, with the Vegas Chapel meme stamped across it like graffiti, the timestamps lined up with the night at the Polo Bar, the bench near the staff entrance, the room where Ethan laid papers on a nightstand like penance. Grace didn't make a sound. Her breath went shallow and efficient, the way a body breathes when it starts lowering the lights to survive. Ethan padded in from the bedroom, hair mussed, t-shirt soft from 100 washes, unaware that innocence and ignorance looked the same from a distance. "You're up," he said, and then he saw the iPad. The screen threw a pale light up under his jaw, turning him into a man lit by a campfire he didn't mean to start. He reached for the device. Grace tilted it away without looking at him, thumbs sliding through the carousel of screenshots like turning pages in a book about someone else's cruelty that used her face for illustration. "It's old," he said immediately, the truth and the defense colliding in the same syllable. "It's accurate," she replied, voice level as a spirit level. The kitchen clock ticked with the unbearable politeness of time that refuses to intervene. "I stopped it," he said, and the verb felt thin. "I cut him off. You started it," she said, finally meeting his eyes. "You turned my life into a dare you wanted to win." He took a step closer. She took none. "I fell in love with you," he said, and the sentence landed like a bouquet thrown at a closed window. "After," she answered, "after you turned me into a project, after you made me a storyline, after you told yourself that love could clean the mess that brought me here." Maria, who had been in the hallway with a stack of clean towels and the kind of dread that recognizes a storm 30 miles out, set the towels down and stayed out of sight. Ethan adjusted, reached for honesty without anesthesia. "You're right," he said. "I did the worst thing first, and then I tried to undo it, and that doesn't erase the first thing." He fumbled for the coffee maker and then abandoned the gesture, hands empty and guilty in the same second. "Tell me what you need," he said, and Grace's laugh arrived without humor. "Space," she said, "to hear my own voice without yours answering for it." She moved past him with a practiced grace that had nothing to do with etiquette and everything to do with survival. In the bedroom, she pulled a carry-on from the closet and packed like a woman who has left places before. Essentials first. Sentiment later, if ever. Maria hovered in the doorway, eyes soft, spine steady. "Kansas?" she asked gently. "Kansas," Grace said. "My mother's appointment got moved up. Maybe the universe is kinder at scheduling than people are." Maria nodded once and squeezed her hand. "I'll get the car." News travels faster than regret. By the time the elevator whispered them down to the lobby, a camera waited outside with the blank curiosity of a shark. The doorman, Carl, stepped between the lens and the women with a professionalism that bordered on devotion. "Not today," he told the photographer, and the man lowered the camera just enough to pretend he had. Ethan followed, hair combed by his hands, no armor, except the truth and the hope that it might not be too late. "I'll come with you," he started, and Grace shook her head without anger. "You'll make it a show," she said, "even if you don't mean to." The car door closed on the rest of his sentence. Maria's eyes met his in the rearview mirror, kind but not uncertain about the hierarchy of her loyalties. The SUV merged into the soft snarl of West Street traffic and was gone, leaving Ethan on the curb among the cigarette-butt constellations, a man who had finally learned the difference between wanting redemption and deserving it. Richard called within minutes, because efficiency is its own theology. "You will issue a statement," he said without greeting, "clarifying intent, condemning misinformation, and affirming the Foundation's commitment to—" Ethan cut him off, something he had done in fantasy 1,000 times and in life never once. "I will issue an apology," he said. "No clarifying, no spin, no words that insult the people who have to read them." Richard's silence felt like a bank freezing funds. "Don't be naive," the elder Parker said. "The narrative must be managed." Ethan looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the elevator. The man in the suit who had grown into a suit for a father. "The narrative is me," he said, "and I'm done outsourcing my conscience." He hung up before courage could ask for interest and opened his laptop to write, fingers hovering like they were about to play an instrument he'd never properly practiced. "I married Grace Miller as part of a bet." The first sentence scorched the page. He kept going. "It was dehumanizing, cowardly, and an act I will regret for a very long time. Any good you've seen from me since does not erase that harm. I am ending my friendship with Chad Reynolds and making a donation, in Grace's name, to the hospital in Kansas City, not as payment for forgiveness, which no one owes me, but as the beginning of repair." He read it twice, sent it once, and then sat very still while the city rearranged its opinion one notification at a time. Grace's flight to Kansas City was bumpy in the way flights are when weather is practicing an argument with itself. The plane smelled like coffee, citrus cleaner, and stranger's breath. She sat by the window and watched the country flatten and brown, the grid of fields like graph paper where someone had solved for X and forgot to erase the work. A toddler cried, then slept. A businessman ate almonds with a fury that suggested he was avenging something smaller. Grace's hands ached from clenching and unclenching, and she let them rest in her lap like two small animals she was trying not to scare. The inbox on her phone filled with messages like offerings and like knives, apologies from people who owed her none, accusations from people who owed her everything. A single text from an unknown number that simply said, "You deserved better first." She saved that one. When wheels hit runway, she inhaled as if air had been rationed and this was her turn. The hospital's lobby greeted her with the democratic smell of antiseptic and coffee. A volunteer at the desk wore a knit cardigan and a name tag that said June, and her smile performed the soft alchemy of making the tired feel temporarily like guests. In her mother's room, sunlight pooled on the foot of the bed, and a monitor beat time no orchestra would argue with. "Baby," her mother said, voice thin and lit. "I saw the internet marching around your name." Grace sat and tucked a strand of hair behind her own ear, like she was borrowing a gesture from a gentler day. "It's loud," she said. "It will be," her mother replied. "Then it won't be." Ethan arrived 20 hours later, not with cameras or handlers, but with a carry-on and a face that had rehearsed humility and chosen not to perform it. He didn't go to the hospital first. He went to Main Street, where a gazebo sat in a square that did not require permits, and he asked the town clerk what the rules were for being sorry in public. By early evening, word had outrun him. The Parker heir at the bandstand, a folding mic on a pole, a man who looked like trouble trying to learn the grammar of contrition. People came, some out of curiosity, some out of annoyance, some because being a person in a town means showing up to see what another person will do. He wore no tie. He held no notes. He had them, but he kept them in his pocket like an addiction he was not feeding tonight. "My name is Ethan Parker," he said, voice carrying just enough to reach the benches where teenagers pretended not to listen. "I married Grace as part of a bet." A ripple passed through the crowd, the relief of a confession that does not waste time pretending to be anything else. "That sentence should be the whole thing," he continued. "It's enough to judge me by, but I came here to say more because the person I married is more." He spoke about harm like it was an invoice, about repair like it was a verb, about the difference between loving someone and wanting to be seen loving them. He named Chad. He named the donation and the hospital and the fact that money is a poor bandage for wounds it helped open. "No one owes me forgiveness," he said, and a dog barked nearby and then stopped, as if the sound itself had decided it would not interrupt. June from the hospital stood near the back, eyes sharp, cardigan patient. She would later say, the thing that surprised her was how he didn't ask the crowd to believe him. He asked them to watch him. Reporters were there, the kind who drive themselves, not the kind a network deploys, and they recorded the speech without clipping it into convenience. When he finished, he stepped back from the mic and did not look around for approval. He looked at his shoes, which had dust on them that did not belong to New York. Grace had been standing at the edge of the square for the last 5 minutes, hair pulled into a careful knot, hands empty, heart loud. She hadn't planned to be there. She had gone for a walk because hospitals shrink a day into something too tight, and Main Street had opened like a corridor that knew her name. She watched him in profile, which felt less dangerous. And then she walked forward because she had been walking forward all year. The crowd inhaled like a single large creature. Ethan turned and found her with his eyes like a thirsty person finds the memory of water. He didn't move toward her. He waited, a small, radical thing. They sat on the gazebo steps because offering a throne to a conversation this human would have been obscene. For a moment they said nothing. The town did the talking. Cicadas in the maples, a pickup rolling slowly, a pair of kids trading a skateboard like a baton. Grace began. "You told the truth," she said, out loud, "not to fix me, to fix you." He nodded. "I don't know if I'm fixable," he admitted. "I know that I can stop choosing the version of me that did that to you." She looked down at his hands. No ring today. He had left it on the bathroom counter in New York, like a man who understands symbols better than he used to. "You didn't ask for my forgiveness up there," she said. "Thank you." He swallowed. "I want your future," he said, and his voice thinned. "And I understand that future might be the first good thing I don't get to keep." The town clerk turned the square's lights on, soft globes humming to life, because darkness arrives whether or not a couple has resolved their argument. Grace breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth, the methodical tide of someone who has trained for endurance. "This doesn't get undone," she said. "It gets outgrown." He nodded again, the gesture small, the meaning large. Narrator, climax, CTA, belonging trigger. If you're still here, if your chest is tight and your throat feels hot because you've lived some version of this, be part of this with us. Hit subscribe now so you're here tomorrow for what comes after the hardest truths. We share a new chapter every day, and this community holds space for endings that learn how to become beginnings. When they stood, it wasn't to walk into a kiss or a camera. It was to walk side by side down a quiet street toward the hospital where a woman who had taught a girl to read soup cans was falling asleep to the soft gossip of machines. "Can I see your mother?" Ethan asked, the way a student asks if he may enter a classroom he once vandalized. Grace weighed the question and the man asking it. "Tomorrow," she said, "if you're still in town." His smile was quick and ashamed and grateful all at once. "I'll be on the bench out front at 7, he said, "with coffee." She almost laughed at the audacity of him thinking he was qualified to choose a brew. "June drinks it black," she said. "I don't." He inclined his head. Noted. They stopped outside the sliding doors that sigh open for everyone and no one in particular. "Don't make speeches tomorrow," she added. "Just be useful." He nodded, and the nod contained a list of assignments he intended to complete. That night, in the motel off the interstate where the carpet had an honest stain and the air conditioner performed heroically, Ethan drafted a second statement and then deleted it. He drafted a text to Chad and did not send it because blocking a number sometimes says more clearly what a speech cannot. He set an alarm for 6:15 and stared at the ceiling until the texture made a topography of mistakes he could name. Across town, in a hospital chair designed by someone who believed in posture more than comfort, Grace watched her mother sleep and let the rhythm of the monitor teach her how to wait without breaking. She dozed and woke and dozed again, and in the hall a cart squeaked, and in the parking lot a siren wailed. And somewhere in the building a baby hiccuped its first demand. Just before dawn, she took out her phone and opened the Notes app, wrote 3 lines, deleted 2, left 1, windows that open. It was not a plan or a promise. It was a preference. Sometimes that is where rescue begins. Richard Parker didn't wait for Ethan to come back to New York. He flew to Kansas, which told Ethan everything about the level of damage control his father believed was required. The meeting happened not at the hospital, but at the Parker-owned downtown hotel, in a suite that smelled of leather polish and restraint. Ethan arrived with his shirt sleeves rolled and his pulse loud. Richard was already standing by the window, tie perfectly knotted, jaw set like a line item. "You could have handled this quietly," Richard said, not turning yet. "I did," Ethan answered, closing the door. "For too long." Richard turned now, eyes the exact shade of judgment a boardroom prefers. "You confessed to strangers before you even tried to repair this family's name." "This isn't about the family's name," Ethan shot back. "It's about my wife's." A silence stretched, heavy enough to bend the carpet. "She will leave you," Richard said flatly, "and all you'll have done is damage the brand and hand your enemies a headline. If she leaves me," Ethan said, stepping closer, "it won't be because of the headline. It'll be because I let your voice live in my head longer than hers." Richard's eyes narrowed, a man unaccustomed to losing leverage. "You think integrity is a luxury you can afford?" Ethan's laugh was sharp. "No, I think integrity is the first thing we should have paid for." For a moment, Richard's face softened, something old and reluctant surfacing. A memory of the boy Ethan had been before Parker Hotels had turned him into a performance piece. "You sound like your mother," Richard said, almost quietly. "I'm trying to," Ethan replied, and walked out before the conversation could turn into a settlement offer. Chad, of course, was less subtle. He showed up that evening at the hotel bar, like trouble that smells its own smoke. The place was dim, bourbon-scented, full of soft jazz and a bartender who had learned not to flinch. Ethan was nursing a club soda, the day's confession still echoing, when Chad sat beside him, grinning like a man with bad timing. "You really went full martyr," Chad said, flagging the bartender for a double. "Standing in the town square, admitting everything? Bold strategy." "It wasn't strategy," Ethan said without looking at him. "Sure," Chad sneered. "You just donated $5 million and ruined your PR for fun." Ethan turned, slow as a hinge that had finally been oiled. "You think this is about optics?" "It's always about optics," Chad said, lifting his glass. "We were playing the same game. You just decided to lose publicly." The glass was halfway to his mouth when Ethan knocked it gently but firmly onto the bar, the bourbon sloshing out like an exclamation point. "Game's over," Ethan said, "and you don't get to say we anymore." Chad's smile thinned. "Careful, you still owe me." "I don't owe you anything," Ethan cut him off, standing now. "Not money, not friendship, not one more chance to turn my wife into your punchline." The bartender froze mid-polish. The air in the room crackled. Chad's grin collapsed into something meaner. "She'll leave you," he said, echoing Richard without knowing it. Ethan nodded once. Calm now. "Maybe she will. But if she does, At least it won't be because I let you write the ending." He left cash for the spilled drink and walked out into the Kansas night, where the air was cool and smelled faintly of cut grass. Chad stayed at the bar, nursing the loss like a man who realizes the game isn't just over. It was never really his. Morning returned like a quiet dare. Ethan was on the bench outside the hospital at 6:55. 2 coffees steaming in the cold air, a paperback of Baldwin open on his lap, though he hadn't turned a page. When Grace came through the sliding doors, she looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether the man in front of her was the same one from the screenshots. He didn't stand right away. He let her choose the distance. She sat beside him. The coffee he offered was wrong, too sweet, but she drank anyway, because sweetness can be corrected. "You stayed," she said simply. "I'm learning to," he replied. They didn't talk about the statement or the bar fight with Chad or the words with Richard. They talked about her mother's upcoming procedure, about the garden Grace wanted to plant next spring, about a small house she had seen online with a porch big enough for chairs. And when the conversation turned quiet, Ethan didn't fill it with apologies. He let it stay quiet, proof that some silences are sacred. When visiting hours began, Grace said, "You can come in today. No speeches." He nodded. No speeches. The camera crews never arrived. The world had moved on to louder stories. And inside the hospital room, Grace introduced Ethan, not as a brand or a scandal, but simply as the man who was trying to show up on time for the rest of his life. Narrator, final CTA, belonging trigger. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the second chances we give or refuse, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which moment hit you hardest. And if you want to follow the rest of our stories, subscribe now so you don't miss the next chapter. Here every day we bring you a new story worth staying for.